This video response is going to go out to Michelle Guido, and that's because of a couple of tweets that you put out recently, one of which I actually responded to, the other one I didn't. But this is my response to your two tweets, and hopefully you'll comprehend this. And if you're wondering what I'm doing right now, I'm doing an actual live stream. That's why you're seeing me at an angle here. I hope you understand that. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tell you a little story. And hopefully you'll get the point of the story after I give this to you. Now, there will be some hyperlinks down here in the description below, one of which will take you to a cookbook, an old-time cookbook. The other ones, well, you just have to check them out for yourself. And I hope you get the point of all this as I tell you this story. I'm going to entitle this story, George and the Squirrels. Okay, so let me tell you about George and the Squirrels. So first of all, we've got to tell you about Bob. Okay, Bob lived in a very lovely suburban neighborhood. And this neighborhood had some squirrels in it. And Bob loved squirrels. He just loved to feed them in the wintertime. He'd stick out corn cobs and other type things so that the squirrels could be fed throughout the winter and they wouldn't starve as they were going through the wintertime. And he liked to watch them play in the snow and run up the trees in the summertime and that kind of thing. Well, one day, a guy moved into the neighborhood. And Bob went up to this guy and he says, well, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. Who are you? And this guy says, well, my name is George. And this guy, George, he says, I'm glad, I'm thrilled to be here. And he says, I hope we become great neighbors. And Bob and George really became fast friends. And as they did, George ended up telling Bob that his grandparents had been born in the Netherlands. And Bob thought that was fascinating. And George told him some stories about his grandparents and where they came from and the whole 9 yards. And Bob just loved the stories. He really did. So like I said, Bob and George, they became very fast friends. And they helped each other out and so on and so forth. And everything was going fine. But then one day, Bob decided to feed the squirrels. It was wintertime, and he tried to feed the squirrels. And he noticed that the number of squirrels that were in his yard wasn't as big as they had been before. He was like, I wonder why there's not as many squirrels around. Now, he thought to himself, well, perhaps some of them had not run across the road in a timely manner. You know how some of these squirrels, they just kind of run across the road and, well, things don't go as well as they hoped. That kind of thing. Then he also thought to himself, well, maybe some of these squirrels just got sick and they didn't make it. Who knows? But he didn't give much thought. He just found it a little curious that there weren't as many squirrels around. Well, by spring, George went up to Bob and he says, look, he says, I tell you what. He says, you've been such a great neighbor to me. He says, I would like to make some stew for you and for some of the surrounding neighbors. And Bob thought that was a great idea, a great way to gather the people together. So Bob invited a couple of the neighbors, and they came over, and George made this humongous pot of stew. He really did. He was mixing it together, and he made it, and he gave it to people, and everybody thought the stew was delicious. They were like, wow, this is a great stew. And they were just eating this up right and left. Well, then, eventually, Bob says, hey, George, he says, this stew is fantastic. I would love to have the recipe to this. Bob said, well, okay. So Bob goes over to his bookshelf, and he pulls his cookbook off the shelf, and he says, this is a copy of a cookbook that my grandparents owned a long time ago, and they gave it to me. He says, how would you like to check it out? He says, well, sure. He said, well, you wanted to see this stew recipe? He says, oh, let me open this up for you, and I'm going to let you see the stew recipe. Well, Bob indeed checked out the recipe of the stew. And he was like, huh. Well, this kind of explains what's going on with the squirrels. So, George, well, actually Bob was like, well, he tried to be polite, and he was like, well, thank you very much, and he gave the book back to George, and he quietly excused himself. He quietly excused his wife as well. And then later on, Bob told the other neighbors about the recipe of the stew. And you can pretty much see that since a lot of these neighbors liked these squirrels just as much as Bob did, they suddenly weren't so fond of George. And they started giving George the cold shoulder. He couldn't figure out why. And then one of them finally explained what the real situation was, and George decided, well, he'd move away. And that's what he did. Anyway, so why did I tell you this story? Well, I'm going to leave some hyperlinks in the description below that's going to help you completely comprehend why I told you this story. Because it may not make a whole lot of sense unless I tell it to you. Alright, so I hope you will check out these hyperlinks and let me know what you think. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video, so I would like for you to stay tuned.